it's kind of late for me, but for some people on West Coast, it's like, I haven't even had dinner yet. So glad that you all can join. Okay, I think we probably are close to being able to get started here. Let's see. Just want to take a quick check. Okay. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm just so appreciative of you taking your Friday night to join this little video, and hopefully you will learn something new. I just wanted to share real quick for those of you who don't know me. My name is Susanna, and I am from a relatively new platform, Food Intolerance Baby, and we are a mom-to-mom platform that's designed to support mamas who are breastfeeding through food intolerances. And I have done that 2 times around. I'm actually dealing with my second baby with food intolerances. She is 6 months old. My son, I breastfed for 2 years, and he was a piece of work. He was the most difficult baby ever in all respects, but he was so hard to pinpoint with his food intolerances and was so sensitive to soy. I mean, I had to cut out everything under the sun for him. And I just felt like I learned so much, but I also feel like it was so hard to find the resources that I needed at the time. And I heard like one thing from one provider and another thing from another, and just, you know, trying to take it all in and talk to so many different people. I don't know if any of you have felt that way, please comment. But it was just a really hard journey. But my journey this time around with my daughter has been so much easier. And I know part of that is just doing this a second time around, but I just feel like I've learned so much that I just want to share. So the Food Intolerance Baby platform has cheat sheets and resources for you, working on recipes that I've come up with, hoping to do a meal plan. And we have a lot of great things. We have a Facebook group right now that is growing and just full of lots of great mamas. So I will link that below. We also have an email list if you want to stay up to date on stuff like what Dr. Trill is doing or freebies. I will link that for you too if you want to get on the email list, and you can follow either of us on Instagram if that's your preferred social besides Facebook. I know Dr. Trill is really active on Instagram. That's kind of her space, and she's at free2feed, free.to.feed. And mine is food_baby intolerance. I can't think as I'm like saying. I will post it all below. But yeah, so I just wanted to share that about myself, and I'm just so excited to be doing this video, and I know I'm going to learn so much too tonight. So I want to just real quickly let you know what tonight's going to look like. We will try not to take up too much of your time, but hoping to fit in as much as we can. And I want her to introduce a little bit about herself and her story, and then we're going to go into 4 myths about breast milk and food intolerances and kind of the science behind it and what Dr. Trill's been learning. And then stick around for a live Q&A at the end. So if you think of anything as we're doing this, post your question and hopefully we will get to it at the end. So yeah, I am super excited to jump into this with you. So Dr. Trill, tell us about your story a little bit and how you got into this whole thing.
Absolutely. So hello, everybody. And first and foremost, I have to give a huge shout out. Thank you so much for hosting this. This is amazing. And I'm just very excited to be a part of this Facebook Live and to talk to everybody. So with that, a little bit of background. My name is Trill. I am a molecular biologist and I'm the founder of Free2Feed. While I was finishing my PhD in molecular biology, I actually have a background in cancer research. I had my first daughter, and at 3 weeks old, we ended up in the hospital because she had severe rectal bleeding, and her body broke out in a rash, and it was absolutely terrifying. And up until then, she had really bad colic, and so we had taken her in and said, you know, she's broke, please fix her. All she does is cry. We were just told, maybe dairy, probably not. She just cries, she has colic, good luck with that, and sent home. And so then when we ended up being admitted to the hospital, it was obvious that it wasn't just colic and there was something wrong to cause her to be in so much pain, to cry constantly. And it was really an uphill battle from there. So I was breastfeeding at the time, exclusively breastfeeding, and I really wanted to continue breastfeeding because it was not an easy task for me, and I felt like I was just getting the hang of it. And then I was legitimately told, your breast milk's killing your baby and you can't breastfeed anymore. And so I just remember like sitting in the stairwell of the hospital, pumping and bawling, to be told that and to be in that space and feel that way, right? And so at that point, they had put her on a starvation diet for 24 hours and eventually gave her a specialized formula, which of course she gulped down because who wouldn't after 24 hours of not eating? And I started asking questions because the formula that they said she had to be on, because it was so specialized, it was incredibly expensive. And I was in grad school. And so if I'm super honest, I just could not afford that formula on a regular basis. And so I asked, okay, well, if you can make hypoallergenic formula, can I make hypoallergenic breast milk? And the answer was a hesitant, yeah, you can, but it's going to be awful. And they were right on both accounts. Yes, you can. And yeah, at times it's awful. So I did do that for my oldest for a year, and we breastfed for a year. And I was top 8 free plus oats and corn, and just lived that life the whole time because I didn't know any differently. And when my second baby was born with the same ailment, unfortunately, I had finished grad school by this point and kind of had my feet under me a little better. And this time around, I was just astonished that there wasn't like more information for parents and that the information was just all over the place as far as, you know, what was being shared by medical professionals, what was being shared by all kinds of different groups, and then what was the science actually showed. So the nice thing about being a scientist is I have access to all of these scientific research journals. So I took it upon myself to basically start taking that research and translating it into digestible content, pun intended, for everyday parents. And that's where Free to Feed was born. And at the same time as I'm nursing my second baby, I'm allergen free, I'm hungry. I am just happened by all kinds of irony to be working for a dairy processing facility where I learned that we can test cow's milk for the presence of other allergens. And it just sparked a huge question in my mind as to, okay, well, if I can do that for cows, like why can't we do this for women? I would love to go eat an egg and then know when it is or is not in my breast milk. And so that kind of led me down this crazy path that has been scientist turned entrepreneur, where now my mission is breastfeeding research and food intolerance research in order to eventually get to the point where we'll have a product to allow moms real time at home to test their breast milk for the presence of allergens. So yeah, that's the general place where I'm at right now. Both of my babies are 5 and almost 2. I breastfed the youngest until she was 1 as well. And both have outgrown their food intolerances, thank goodness. And I love to help moms, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation to kind of demystify some of the information that's, you know, spread by all kinds of places right now.
Wow, I did not know that about milk, like cow's milk, that you can test for different allergens, which would make total sense. I mean, because it's such a huge industry, but yeah, it makes you wonder, like, you know, we have so many women, I feel like more and more, that are dealing with this problem, particularly just, you know, dairy intolerance. And just the fact that you can't test it is crazy. Yes. So you were working there, like, were you specifically testing milk there? Is that what you were doing, or were you working in a different area?
Yeah, so part of my job with the dairy processing facility is running the quality department. And so that's running the lab in addition to some other departments. And so with that, like actually training people how to, let's say the processor was running soy milk. And then after the processor's done, they clean everything, they run regular milk, but they have to make sure that they didn't accidentally get soy into regular milk or vice versa. So there's these testing mechanisms available for the food manufacturing industry. in order to make sure that no cross contact happened because you're using the same equipment. And so that was literally like me teaching other people, me teaching lab techs how to test cow's milk for the presence of another allergen. And I was literally like, I wonder what would happen if I just squirted some milk on this thing.
That's crazy. That's so awesome. Guys, I don't know about you, but I am super excited about the prospect of this. Just, you know, being able to like have test strips or something to test your baby. Like, I think that's the biggest frustration with this a lot of times is like, what did I eat? What is causing this right now? Like, you think you ate totally clean and, you know, or you're still trying to figure out what the intolerance is. And oh my gosh, it's just very frustrating. Well, that kind of ties us into the first question and the first myth. And so that is how long do allergens stay in breast milk? I know that a lot has, you know, said that it's, you know, 2 weeks, mom needs to clear it out for a really long time, or moms are told to switch to formula while their breast milk clears out the allergens. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a huge myth. So I've interviewed hundreds of women and I've heard everything from a few hours to 28 days, I think is the longest that I've heard during my interviews, as far as like how long a protein actually stays in your breast milk. So the actual science shows that when you ingest any kind of protein, that it'll go into your digestive system, you break it down, and if for some reason it's able to transmit into your circulatory system, and this can be because you're not able to digest that protein efficiently or some other issue, if it's able to transmit into your bloodstream, it can then go to your mammary glands, and then those cells, as they're making milk, will essentially secrete that protein into your breast tissue, into your breast milk, and then baby can consume it. So while I can talk a little bit to the point of why we may say that it takes 2 weeks, which is a pretty typical answer to leave your breast milk, the actual answer is 2 to 8 hours, which is a huge difference from 2 weeks, especially when we're talking about this particular topic. So the science shows that after ingestion, typically the concentration of the allergen peaks at around 2 hours post-ingestion. So mom eats it, digests it, ends up in her milk, and we see this peak 2 hours after ingestion, which totally makes sense. And then we see that after that peak, it just steadily declines. Now, how long it takes for that decline to go all the way to the point where it's not undetectable, it varies depending on the woman, how often you feed, how hydrated you are, how much ended up in your milk in the first place. But typically we see that it clears to undetectable ranges, which would be a range that you would react to within 8 hours. And so typically what I advise moms, depending on their situation, is that if they consume dairy or soy or something of that accord on accident or on purpose, because everything needs a kind of Ben and Jerry's every once in a while, that you should be clear of that allergen within 24 hours.
Wow, that is crazy because I just feel like that's not talked about. Do you think that, because I feel like there's, you know, different answers that people get, particularly from their care providers. Do you think that it's just like the science, the research hasn't caught up from maybe when they went to med school and they learned about this, or did they even learn about it in med school? Like, I guess what's kind of the disconnect when it comes to care providers, pediatricians, etc.?
That's a good question. So I think from my conversations that I've had with pediatricians, because it's really important in my space to understand like each player and how their situation is adding to or this really complicated situation for moms. And a lot of times what I've found is that mom will be told that it takes 2 weeks for it to clear her milk because it's not often covered in typical medical school curriculum, because you get a general basis. And then from there, when you go to specialize, a lot of times when you're specializing, you are shadowing another pediatrician. So if that pediatrician hasn't kept up with the research and the actual data behind how long it takes, then they're going to pass down what they know. And what they know is most likely that it takes 2 weeks in order for it to clear milk. The other piece of that is their experience, right? So what they experience is that mom will say, I cut milk or I cut dairy, cow's milk protein from my diet. Why do I still see a reaction? And instead of saying and explaining to mom that, it takes several days, up to several weeks for the baby to heal, they just say, oh, it's just in your milk longer. It's an easier answer to just say, yeah, if you eat cheese, it's going to be in your milk for 2 weeks and you'll see a reaction for 2 weeks. Instead of sitting down and explaining the nuances of, baby has been exposed to something that they're intolerant to for who knows how long at that point, right? For example, my baby at that point for 3 weeks, I was, enjoying all of the cheese. And so at that point, she needed several weeks to heal. And that is whether I'm breastfeeding her or I switch her over to formula. So yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's not keeping up with the research, not adding it to the curriculum, and really a lot of med school doesn't have a ton of nutrition curriculum built in. I know they're working on that and it's improving because I have a lot of friends in med school, but it's something that needs to continuously happen. And so until then, there's going to be this misinformation that continues to spread. And the last piece to that is that the research is lacking, right? So as is much research involving moms, involving women and women-based problems, there needs to be more research and it needs to be more widely spread and talked about. And so with that, until there are really solid research studies and they're really popular and shared amongst all of these pediatricians, that's going to continue to be the case.
Now, somebody just kind of brought up something which maybe is a little confusing in this. She said, so does that mean I can have a bowl of ice cream? So it doesn't, because even though it leaves your breast milk, correct, that means that it's going to be in baby system. Now, what about the pump and dump situation? Could somebody have a bowl of ice cream and then, pump and dump?
Yes. So I will caveat this with, this will depend on obviously what type of reactions you're seeing. So if you have a baby that's had an anaphylactic or acute reaction to your breast milk, I don't recommend playing with this, just for the sake of making sure that we don't accidentally cause any kind of reaction. That being said, that means that yes, you should be able to have a bowl of ice cream. And then if you wanted to pump and dump for the next 8 to 24 hours, I know several moms that will do 24 hours just to make sure. And you have the ability to either supplement with formula or supplement with pumped milk. That's definitely an option for you.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And I think part of it was I didn't know that information beforehand, but also, it's scary to like risk it too, because you're like, well, what if they have a reaction? But I think the point of it is like, their reaction probably wouldn't be as bad as if it was in that time frame of the proteins being really elevated. But
right,
the thing too is every person is different, so there's no way to exactly know like, oh, mine is going to peak at 2 hours and mine's going to peak at 8 hours or whatever.
Right. And there's always the outliers, people who are going to hold on to it for longer for whatever reason. But that's where it's super important for us to do more research on this and understand it better. And also for us to just have something that we could have at home to test our milk and know. So one thing that's really important to know here is that if you take 100 women and you give them all a bowl of ice cream, only about 50 of them will end up with cow's milk protein in their breast milk. And that's dependent on metabolism, last time they nursed, last time they fed, last time they ate, all those things come into play here. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of great research that says like better metabolism means, faster out of breast milk, right? But the piece here is that if we just had something at home that we could literally express milk onto or put some pumped milk onto, either way, and just know, oh, I'm clear, I ate a bowl of ice cream and it didn't end up in my breast milk this time, which is definitely a possibility. So I'm good to go and I can feed immediately.
It kind of makes me think of those, which you've probably used this analogy before, but you know, those like tests to tell whether you have too much alcohol in your system.
Yes.
I feel like it's very similar kind of to that whole thing.
Very much so. And, you know, similar even time frames, right? For when it's going to peak in your breast milk and then when it metabolizes out.
Interesting. So, okay, let's get into our second myth, kind of myth versus truth, because again, and this is not to say anything negative against care providers, but I feel like initially they say, you know, cut out dairy. And then if that doesn't work, they either say cut out dairy or soy, but a lot of times they say cut out top 8. And I guess from my experience, I feel like the top 8, the typical top 8 for adults and children and those that have severe reactions are somewhat different than the top 8 for babies with food intolerances. So what are, I guess, some surprising allergen facts? Tell us about specifically like lactose and then also soy, because, or I guess dairy and soy, since those are the two most common.
Yeah, for sure. So interesting thing about cow's milk protein. So when your healthcare provider says you should cut dairy, there gets to be some confusion around the difference between lactose-free and then actual cow's milk protein free. And so a lactose free product will be made of dairy, will be made of cow's milk, with a special enzyme added so that that enzyme essentially eats the lactose for you. And the lactose is just the sugar part of cow's milk. And so we literally in the dairy industry will take cow's milk, add some enzyme in there that eats away the lactose for you. So then when you drink it, you don't have to digest and break down that lactose. So it's lactose free. Now, there's a difference there between an intolerance, meaning that I consume it and I'm not able to digest it very well and it just doesn't agree with me. So I have some sort of reaction, and typically it happens to do with the gut, wherein the actual like cow's milk protein intolerance or a cow's milk protein allergy, it's not the lactose that's causing it. It's actually the proteins that make up cow's milk. And there are a few different proteins that make up cow's milk, and each of them has their own prevalence for how often it is that someone will be allergic to one of the proteins versus another. But it's really important to know that there's a difference. So if you are trying to cut cow's milk protein from your diet, it's not enough to cut just dairy that is lactose free. You have to cut actual all dairy products. So if it has any sort of dairy in it whatsoever, whey or any of the other million names that dairy kind of hides under, then you should go to something else that is not based by dairy. And so with that, you know, some good alternatives are nuts, coconut, and oat are some different options that are really good dairy alternatives. But if you don't completely cut the dairy in all forms, then it's very likely, if that is the intolerance, that you'll continue to see symptoms in your baby. Then switching over to the soy question. For soy, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of confusion about the different derivatives of soy, right? So we know that soy is very similar in structure to dairy, which is why a portion of babies who are intolerant to dairy or allergic to dairy will also be so for soy. The interesting thing is that when you get into soy and then its derivatives, you have soy oil, and you have soy, I'm gonna say it wrong. You say it for me?
Lecithin? That's how I say it.
Yeah, lecithin. Yes, I'm literally like seeing the word, like don't say it the way that you think you want to say it. So with that soy derivative, the interesting thing is that they literally take soy, they create it, they turn it into an oil, they do a chemical kind of composition with it, they change it, and then they are taking like a piece of the emulsification that comes from that. So it's so processed. So, I mean, obviously that's a whole nother conversation for whether or not that's a healthy thing to consume. But in general, most people who have a soy intolerance will not be allergic to the soy derivatives. The reason why is because once you take a soybean, turn it into an oil, you're getting rid of most of the proteins. And then when you do this extra processing, you're getting rid of even more of the proteins. So it's less likely that those things will cause a reaction, because then there's no more protein left for you to consume to end up in your breast milk, which is causing the reactions. That being said, that's not always the case. There are moms that I have talked to that have said, yes, if I eat anything that's even been near a soybean, I swear there's a reaction, and I believe them 110%. So just keeping that in mind, that as you're trialing and as you're going through this craziness that is an elimination diet, it may be beneficial to you to give these other derivatives a chance to see, can I actually eat these? Because it does open up your kind of dietary window, if you will, significantly, if you can eat some of the derivatives.
That's so interesting. I did not realize that the soy protein is similar. You said it's similar in structure.
Yes.
So would that explain why things like, or foods like beef or legumes, pea protein are sometimes also an issue?
Yes. Yep. So a lot of times especially for infants in particular, they're reacting to the protein structure. And their issue comes from the kind of structure itself. So they can be allergic to many things that are similar. A good example of something like this is also a latex allergy. So people who are allergic to latex will sometimes be allergic to fruits that the structure is very similar to the latex rubber tree. And so very similarly, where if those structures are too close, the body still sees it as bad and still reacts to it.
Yeah, that's crazy. Those related foods, like who would have thought that that would be related to latex? It's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
So would you say, like, for example, wheat, gluten, that are those kind of high up on the spectrum of things to cut? I feel like typically, we say like eggs is next, that kind of thing. Maybe like, what would you say are your top, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 that you have seen the most that cause the most issues? Because I think that's also for a lot of probably moms that are watching this are like, I'm still trying to figure out like what's the next thing I should cut, instead of just kind of grasping at straws.
Yeah, for sure. So the most common is dairy. And then from there, because of how similar they are in structure, the next most common is soy. So those are the first two. If I'm helping a mom, if I'm working through an elimination diet with mom, those are the first two things that I look at. From there, the next most common are typically egg and wheat. And beyond that, you kind of get into a nuance as far as depending on what the reactions are. If it's more along the lines of a gastrointestinal problem versus an esophagus problem, then you can start to tease out some of the next steps, right? So I've cut these 4. What's next? What's number 5? And from there, it really depends on the baby and what symptoms that we see as to which ones I recommend that mom goes ahead and cuts next.
Cool. Hopefully you guys are finding this helpful. There's been some really awesome comments. Please like this if this is something that you're resonating with and is helpful for you to hear, because again, there's just so many questions that are related to these topics. Let's go into the third myth, which are kind of related to what we were just talking about. I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but what are the most common allergens for babies compared to adults? And again, what about things like we've seen, especially in some older research, that stuff like chocolate or strawberries is mentioned to cut out. Should moms be looking at that? Like, is caffeine really a problem? Do we need to give up coffee?
No, don't give up coffee. Drink all the coffee, ladies. So you need it. You deserve it. You had to cut ice cream. Go drink coffee. So with that, yes, there's some old school research that unfortunately is still circulated and talked about. But there's tons of research that shows against those particular things. Now, are there moms who say like, I eat strawberries and I see a reaction? That's definitely a possibility for those moms who have babies with what's called FPIEs. And the reason being is that baby is reacting to that particular protein. It's just not very common. So as far as like chocolate, go eat the chocolate. The problem with chocolate is that most chocolates have some form of dairy or soy. And I know because I've done the allergen-free thing for 2 years total, and I have read every chocolate bar label that exists, I promise. Every single one of them. So I could probably name you all of the allergen-free chocolate bars in the whole world right now. I love chocolate. So with that being said, that's the main piece there, is that there is typically dairy or soy or any other number of allergens in chocolate. If you are dairy-free, there are lots of chocolate options that do not have allergens in them. Thank goodness. I'm continuously grateful that I had this problem in the 21st century and not a few, like even a few decades ago, it would have been much more difficult to find alternative foods. So I will say that. As far as the other pieces, the interesting thing about top 8 is that it's top 8 for the whole population, right? And so a vast majority of the population is not under 1 year old or 2. We're all much older than that. And so when we're looking at the whole population, sure, shellfish, fish, things like that are a top 8 allergen, or top 12 or 11, depending on if you're in another country. That being said, that's not necessarily the case for infants. For infants, we see more commonality to, like you mentioned, those proteins that are similar to dairy in beef, and then you have legumes. So more drifted towards that. And unfortunately, there isn't really good research on the exact numbers, partially because, I mean, half of these poor moms that are probably on here have been dismissed in the first place. And the research just needs to be beefed up as far as this is what you're seeing for your reaction. These are the things you should target first. But the good news is that there's awesome, wonderful people like you that are working on, you know, some cheat sheets and some information that we can give based on the data that we do have, at least.
Yeah, for sure. It's so complicated. And, you know, I hate too for moms that are like, you know, I'm eating 5 different things or whatever. I think that part of this also just has to be the whole gut issue addressed, and the fact that sometimes it's not necessarily mom, you know, it's baby. I just wanted to kind of real quick respond to a comment from Kayla. She said, I believe dairy takes weeks to get out of your system. That's actually been my experience as well. That's related to babies' issues, right, Dr. Trill? Like, that's not related to mom's issues necessarily.
Yep. Yeah. So I'd love to talk on that. And my apologies for not hitting that better a little bit ago. So the research shows, scientifically shown, that if you consume dairy right now, it'll peak and then come out of your milk. Now, the interesting thing about these infant allergies is that it can take a long time for that reaction to, 1, occur, and then 2, for the healing to complete. So let's say I'm going to eat my pint of ice cream right now. I'm going to feed baby in 5 hours. I still have dairy in my system. Baby can potentially not react for 2 days or more before their immune system is like, oh no, I see this, I don't like it. And you actually see a reaction. So that can be so confusing because you're like, what did I eat? That's bad. So you're thinking, you know, that I just had some strawberries with breakfast. And so it must be the strawberries because I just nursed and I just saw this bad diaper, or I just saw this rash. And then from there, you can continue to see that reaction for upwards of 2 weeks or longer. And that depends on baby. That depends on how sensitive they are and how fast they can heal. And so you're going to see that extended timeline, and it makes it super confusing. And it's really unfortunate that that timeline is so confusing that it leads to mom eventually eliminating potentially way more things than she needs to, because it's confusing as to what exactly it's causing the reaction because of that extended healing time and even that extended time to have the initial reaction.
Yeah, and I will say the interesting thing about the situation with my two kids, I think it's harder a lot of times for our first because we don't know what symptoms to look for. And so my son was about 2 months old when I started cutting out stuff, and I did a really bad job of it. Ladies, if any of you feel like you're doing a terrible job, I was a week into being dairy and soy free and had Chinese food and didn't even think about it twice. I was like, oh, wait, I'm not supposed to be consuming this. Like, it's so hard to change. And so it can take a really long time for your baby to clear it out of their system. So for him, I felt like it took a lot longer to see results. And again, that could be the baby. I don't think we know enough, about why some babies are more like it's part of it genetic. Why do some have worse reactions than others? But my daughter, I knew what to look for. I cut stuff out within the first 2 weeks, and her symptoms cleared up so much quicker. So I think part of it too is like, how much damage has been done to the gut, how long they've been dealing with this can result in a longer period of time, which is why I think that, a clear cut answer for everybody of saying, that it takes particular time. Somebody commented on here too and said, what about 8 weeks and detox? It's not necessarily the same answer for every person. Would you agree with that?
As far as an 8-week detox, meaning like gastrointestinal issues?
Yeah, I guess for baby, like to see results that baby is completely clear. Like, is there a particular time frame for every baby that we should be seeing clear results?
There's really not, unfortunately. And because, like you said, we don't know how long baby has been exposed, how bad their sensitivity is. So you're going to have some babies that have been exposed for months and months and months to dairy protein, and they're a little bit intolerant, and a quick switch of the diet, and you'll see a really quick clear up. Absolutely. But the other side of that is baby who is sensitive does get exposed for a long time. Like my oldest daughter was exposed for several weeks, and we just didn't know that what was occurring with her was causing the problem. That was from my breast milk. I had no idea that was a thing. And so it took much longer. And I can say it took weeks for her to fully heal. And we did switch her to a hypoallergenic formula because we were told we had to. And I just pumped like a mad woman. And then finally, eventually got her back to nursing. Thank goodness the specialized formula tastes like sweaty gym socks. So she went back to breastfeeding.
Oh my gosh, I've heard that.
And I will say, I do want to mention that I don't want to discount anyone's experience. I think that it's important to know that there are going to be nuances in science. And so if there is a mom that has some kind of crazy metabolism, some kind of crazy digestive issue or mammary glands that does hold on to dairy, I am not in the business of dismissal, because that's kind of what we've all dealt with for a long time. So what I'll say about that is, if there are any moms that are in that boat, I most certainly want to add them to our next study, because I want to know all about their mammary glands. I mean that in the least creepy way possible.
That's awesome. That kind of ties in with the formula to the fourth myth, which is when can a mother continue to breastfeed versus switching to formula? There are so many GI specialists and care providers that just say, just switch to formula. And, I think both you and I are just really advocating for breastfeeding because it seems like the research doesn't necessarily show that you need to, and particularly with what you're saying with how long the proteins are in the milk. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, which was a great segue, I did not do that on purpose. I was in that boat where we were told you have to go on this elimination diet for 2 whole weeks to do this specialized formula. And in 2 weeks, maybe if you're able to figure this diet out, you can try to go back to nursing. But we don't recommend it. So there's a few interesting pieces here. Obviously, on the medical professional side, it's the easiest answer, right? And it's the easiest answer because those canisters have an ingredient deck on them, right? We're able to figure out what baby can and cannot have, as far as like maybe a soy formula will work, maybe hydrolyzed formula or an elemental formula. That's an easy answer because it can be prescribed and there is no nuance, accidentally eating a cookie type of situation when you're talking about a newborn. So I understand, and most certainly formula has its place. That being said, like you mentioned, I am a huge breastfeeding advocate. Feed all the babies. I work very hard to try to consult moms and parents through this whole situation so they can keep breastfeeding. And so while typically what's told, right, you go to the doctor, you say, this is the issue. If you aren't just flat out dismissed, the medical professional will often tell you, you have to go to the specialized formula and just pump while your milk clears. So you have this transition milk then, right? So now you have 2 weeks of you driving yourself crazy because you're hooked up to a machine constantly. And my heart goes out to all of the exclusively pumping mamas out there. Mad respect. That being said, if that's not what you want to do, and so you're pumping, you're feeding this formula, you're probably freezing all of this milk, right? Like, where am I even going to put all this milk that is contaminated, right? So now we have a freezer full of milk that I can't use, and I finally get to 2 weeks, this magical number, and I can start breastfeeding again. And honestly, that's really not the case. You should keep breastfeeding through these food sensitivities if it's not an anaphylactic reaction. So the only time that I would say, yes, most definitely go to formula is if it's anaphylactic, and you for sure want to make sure that you have nailed your diet very, very well, in that if you know that it's an acute reaction and it causes a really, really bad symptom, that you can go into your home and be like, I know for sure that these are the foods that I can eat and that I can't eat. That is my recommendation there. Now, do you have to do it for 2 weeks? Definitely not. I would just give you enough time so that you can mentally, like you said, make that transition. It's hard to just all of a sudden do a 180 and start eating totally different. I have a very similar story. I went corn-free and literally came home from the hospital and like popped myself a bag of popcorn.
That's great.
I was like halfway through the bowl, like what is wrong with me? You just don't think about it, right? Until like you're really in it. And like my husband accidentally gave me foods, and Lord help us both. Thankfully I didn't kill him, but I thought about it. We had like a list on the fridge, do not feed me these things. It was nuts. So that being said, I recommend in all other cases that you continue to breastfeed, because as you cut that culprit out of your diet, your milk will continuously clear, your cellular metabolism will remove those proteins from your system. You will flush them out either through your breast tissue or through any of the other excrements, and you will be clear, and you should keep breastfeeding.
That's awesome. That's great. Let's jump into this Q&A because there's been a lot of people shooting some really awesome questions. I want to address, there are a few questions that were already collected from our Facebook community, and so I'm going to run through those real quickly. Caitlin had a question related to solids. What are the implications for babies with food intolerance when starting solids, particularly when introducing baby to common allergens?
Yes, so great question. So thank you. I typically recommend that if you're going to start reintroduction, so you know that baby is allergic to dairy and soy, my recommendation is typically to introduce directly to baby, because then it's just known, you know for a fact that baby got dairy. Because of the problem being that if you consume it and then you try to feed it to baby, you don't know if you actually ended up with dairy in your breast milk, and if it was in there when you nursed and how much. And so you can end up with a lot of false negatives, and then that's super confusing, right? Like, I ate ice cream and I didn't see a reaction, yay. And then you go eat pizza and you do see a reaction. So then you're like, is it dairy? Is it tomatoes now, right? Like, I've been there, and your brain just goes all the crazy places. So I recommend that if you know what the allergen is, to introduce directly. And typically, depending on the allergen, there's what's called a ladder system. So you can go at like the most broken down form of the protein. So that's the essential goal of the ladder, is to like break the protein down as much as you can and start there, and then very slowly give them less broken down protein options. So an example would be like taking an egg and cooking it. You're breaking down the proteins, or baking it, and then on down to like just scrambled eggs, right? So with that, you can introduce directly. You will see most likely a more potentially earlier reaction, but that's, I won't say that for sure. And then just because it's a concentrated form, right, as opposed to through your breast milk, because when it's through your breast milk, it's also broken down, and you don't know how much. So are you giving the first rung of the ladder, or are you giving the 7th rung of the ladder? You have no idea, unfortunately. So with that, the other thing that gets brought up in the midst of like introducing allergens is this concept of early and often, right? This idea that if you give baby these allergens early and often in their life, they will have a less chance of having the allergy later on in life. Now, the science has shown that that is the case for peanuts and eggs only. So all of these other proteins, all the other foods, cow's milk protein, soy, all of those things, there's no correlation, 0. And there's actual research on this one. Now, peanuts and egg, there is a small correlation, and the numbers are essentially if you took 1,000 babies and you were able to do all of them early and often with the current rate of our allergy rates in our population, if that makes sense, it would reduce the number of people who would have a peanut allergy by like around 20, and very similar to egg. So out of 1,000 people, around 20 less people would have an allergy. And I'm all about fewer people having allergies 100%. That being said, if you see any kind of reaction, the opposite is true. So if you know that baby has an egg allergy, or you suspect that baby has an egg allergy, that recommendation of early and often is no longer the case for you. Now for you, the recommendation is to avoid completely. So to avoid completely, because essentially what you're going to get is you're going to keep giving that baby that egg. 1, baby's miserable. 2, you're miserable because baby's miserable. And then 3, you're continuing to allow the immune system to see something that it doesn't like. And it's not going to, it's less likely that it will outgrow that reaction. Whereas if you leave it alone and you let the immune system finish developing, which is the problem with the vast majority of these babies, is their immune system is developing continuously. If you let the immune system finish developing, typically those children, if it's not an IgE-mediated reaction, which is like an anaphylactic shock style reaction, I go into that more as far as the different types in my website, it's more likely then that baby will be able to grow out of that allergy, which is definitely what we all want.
For sure, for sure. Okay, Sarah has a question. We have kind of touched on this, but just to get in a really specific scenario, and somebody else in the live chat asked a similar question. In the live chat, they said, if I eat a pizza and then my baby goes to sleep, can I breastfeed in the morning? And Sarah said, if the baby sleeps through the night, would the allergens from the night before be in the milk that she consumes the next morning? So again, is that just sort of a touchy, we don't really know 100%?
Yeah, so that's an amazing question. And unfortunately, this is in the realm of researchers just have not looked at this yet. And I will say that it is in the docket for the researchers that I'm working with, in addition to myself, to look at that. Like if you go overnight and you don't pump and dump, you fall asleep and baby's sleeping, hallelujah, and you get up the next morning, now you have not released any of that milk. The science would indicate that some of your cellular metabolism, will have reduced that concentration of, let's say, dairy from that pizza. However, because you haven't removed the milk from your breast first, there is more likely that it'll be a higher concentration than if you had been feeding all along or pumping all along. So if that's the case, I would recommend, unfortunately, getting up and pumping on your regular schedule every 3 hours, whatever is comfortable for you, so that you are able to remove that milk, because you'll continue to make more milk. The cells will excrete any leftover proteins that they may have been holding on to, and you can kind of remove it from your system. That being said, this is an area, I mean, all women's science needs like so much help, but this is definitely an area that needs more research behind it, and it's super important for moms. And if you were able to test it at home, it would be something that you would just know getting up in the morning, yep, I still have dairy, or nope, it's clear now.
And I just want to touch real quick on that related to the research and the fact we need so much more research. Dr. Trill is actually, she is trying to get grant money right now for the research that she needs to answer these questions. So I included this as a pin post at the bottom, but she is in, what would you call it? I guess it's a contest. It's not really a contest.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it is the Street Shares Female Veteran Founder Grant. And essentially, I applied, I did a video pitch for them, and they picked a top 14. So we're in that top 14 window now, and only the top 3 will move forward for a pitch competition. All of the top 3 will get some form of grant money. And depending on then if you're first, second, or third, that will dictate how much. So if you are available, it takes literally like 20 seconds to click on the link and then go down to the bottom and find Trility. And yeah, it sticks out like a sore thumb. So if you click on there and vote for me, my hope is to then get into the top 3. And all of that research is going towards breastfeeding, food intolerance research that we're doing in the lab.
And that ends this weekend, tomorrow, right?
Yes, it ends Sunday at midnight.
Okay, so yeah, please, we all need this research. So take the 20 seconds and vote. Okay, that was a quick little intermediate thing. I wanted to make sure I brought that up.
Share with your fellow booby friends.
Yeah, for sure. Cheryl had this question: if baby has a soy, dairy, or egg intolerance, is it safe to use breast milk on her skin?
That's a great question. So I would say, one, it really depends on the baby's reactions. So like if the baby's reaction is typically gastrointestinal, I would say you're more likely not to see any issues with using it on the skin. I would treat it just like I would any other lotion or cream. I would literally take that milk and do like a little dab somewhere and see if you see a reaction. My recommendation would be, if you have a large amount of express milk, if you can, combine it. So then if you have a concentration of egg from having some scrambled eggs and then not for a couple of days, that'll dilute it out a little bit. And then just take a little bit of that milk and do a little test on baby and see if you see any reaction. It's not likely that you will, but just in case, it's always better safe than sorry.
That's a good tip. Aaron asks, do the proteins going into your bloodstream have anything to do with leaky gut? I know leaky gut is thrown around a lot, and I guess that's the mom side of things, of whether or not certain moms have more of a propensity to have babies with food intolerances due to their own gut issues. And I don't know if that's in your wheelhouse of research, but yeah, do the proteins going into your bloodstream have anything to do with leaky gut?
So yeah, so the leaky gut is such a funny like term for scientists. For like leaky gut. So essentially the idea being that, for any of you who are not familiar, that you know, your gastrointestinal system being unhealthy in a number of ways that would allow for more transmission of a protein or any other substance, a toxin even, to move from the intestinal system into your bloodstream is the idea behind leaky gut. And so certainly in that realm, that's what's happening. You're literally taking a protein and it's moving from your gastrointestinal system into your intestine. That being said, like leaky gut is such a anomaly, really not an anomaly. I guess anomaly isn't the best word I would use. it's not well understood as to like how to fix it, right? So I have this gastrointestinal system that's in a way allowing more through it than should. How do I fix that? And so there's research behind probiotics, there's research behind fewer processed foods that are feeding the bad bacteria in your gut. And that's a huge part of what needs to happen in the research is once we have identified moms who are more likely to transmit these proteins to their breast milk, why, right? So once we can narrow down who, why is that the case? For example, I recently interviewed him for an NSF grant, and she has 4 babies. Baby number 1 never reacted to dairy in her diet, and she ate dairy all the time. And the second that they gave that baby a regular dairy product, anaphylactic. And the other baby reacts constantly to her breast milk all the time. And she has to be totally dairy free. So it was super confusing for her because she was like, what? I have this baby that's anaphylactic and never reacted to my breast milk versus this baby who is, just intolerant or not anaphylactic at least, and reacts all the time. What the heck? And so, digging in deeper to her situation as to like, what's different now? Is it what other than age is different that would cause her to transmit proteins now, but not transmit proteins a few years ago? And yeah, there's just so much more research that needs to happen there.
I was going to say a really interesting kind of related situation. I have a friend who adopted a baby, and she has been able to use donor milk and several different types of donor milk. And she said that there was one woman who consumed dairy, and her adopted baby had no issues with it. But another woman who had problems with her own baby, like her own baby has food intolerances, this adopted baby had issues with that milk. And I thought that was so interesting because clearly adopted baby doesn't necessarily have dairy issues, or at least maybe the proteins aren't filtering the same way, kind of what you touched on. But again, like I said this when my son was born, like I cannot wait for like 15 years from now when we have so much more research, because, things just in the baby world have changed so much, even from when our moms had babies. And I am just so curious to find out so much more about these things.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely would love to talk to them because I'm super curious about like the donor milk side for food allergies.
Put you in touch with her for sure. And I guess kind of related to your other question, the one that we were just talking about, Abigail was asking, do you notice allergies more in babies of moms who had antibiotics? And I guess that just kind of relates to the whole leaky gut thing. And, we don't really know. I feel like I've seen moms do polls about this in groups, and some of them say, I had no antibiotics. I did, or, and it wasn't really, I just, have you seen like an actual correlation? I haven't necessarily.
Yeah, so one thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot in the last piece was a big part of my next research study that I'm doing in conjunction with the University of Idaho with 2 breast milk super duper experts. They're amazing. They have like 3 decades of breast milk nutrition research experience each. They're amazing. So shout out to them. One of the big things that we're doing in the midst of looking at all this breast milk, we're also looking at the biomarkers. So is there something else in the breast milk, like you mentioned with this adopted baby, is there something else in the breast milk that would trigger baby to actually have this intolerance, right? Like you'll have moms who consume dairy and see a reaction, but give dairy and don't, or, different situations like that. So it's interesting then, like you said, that baby doesn't have, or doesn't from one, but does from another. Is there something else there, right? That's causing the immune system to perk up and be like, what's going on here? And then react to a protein there. So that's a piece of what we're looking at. And then, sorry to move forward into the next question. So there is research that looks, and I talk about it a little bit in my website for the article called Cutting to the Chase, C-sections and food allergies. So it looks at specifically is there correlations, or what is the research behind C-section births and food allergies? And there are some correlations, but they're fairly minute, and certainly there are billions of parents who have had natural and vaginal births, who have all kinds of food allergy infant issues. So I'm definitely not discarding anybody's experience there, but there is some research that shows potentially that when you have an antibiotic, it's going to kill down some of the good bacteria in your intestinal system, thereby, for an example, then allowing more of those proteins to not be digested correctly, allowing more of them to transmit through your circulatory system to breast milk. That being said, those correlations were very small. And so I wouldn't say that that's the smoking gun.
Yeah, I would say from my own experience, I was so like, I'm going to avoid antibiotics no matter what, second pregnancy, and managed to do so somehow. And had a natural, vaginal birth, no drugs whatsoever, and still had a baby who has food issues. However, it was a lot more mild, but I also worked a lot on my gut health during my pregnancy with her. So I mean, the verdict is out as to what actually was related to what, but I have heard, that sometimes it progressively gets worse with subsequent children. So in my particular case, I found that it was interesting that her food intolerances seemed to be more mild. So, again, we need more research. These are all such interesting things to chat about, and it's just hard to know for sure. Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions. There are so many awesome questions, and I wish we could go through all of them, but for the sake of time. Okay, this one I want to touch on because I feel like this is really important. Liana asks, is there any truth to it gets worse before it gets better? My baby never had visible blood in his stool until this last week when I cut out top 8. What do you think about that?
Okay, so what I'll say is, does it get worse before it gets better? There may be a very small window in the very beginning of your elimination diet where, let's say in a perfect world, you are able to eliminate everything that you need to eliminate from your diet, and you see this little blip in symptoms, which may be the case. However, it should be a very small window where that would occur. You wouldn't continue, or you shouldn't continue to see an increase in reactions for any length of time, more than like a day. Maybe 2 days, because we know that the window for reaction is about 48 hours. A day, 2 days, maybe, but after that, you should see, if you've cut the right culprit, you should start to see an improvement rather than a continuing to get worse. And that's just because you're not continuing to give baby that allergen anymore, right? So while baby may continue to have symptoms for a while, so may continue to have colic, reflux, gastrointestinal issues especially, and rash especially, because those take a long time to heal. That may continue for a few weeks, but you should still see like small improvements, or at least like the same situation. I wouldn't say that you should see it get worse. If you see it get worse, then I would dig back into your diet. Some of the things that I've experienced a lot working with so many moms is that a lot of times we start digging into like, let's really look at what everything you're putting into your mouth, which I know is stressful, but what we find is that hidden allergens and supplements, beverages, seasonings, things like that. So if you're continuing to see an increase in reactions, dig back into your diet or consider a different allergen. And this is depending on like your situation, your baby. This isn't a cookie cutter situation, right? Every mom and baby symbiotic relationship is going to be different, and the answer is going to be different. So for example, a mom who she thinks it's dairy, she's cut dairy, she's 100% sure she's cut dairy, and she sees reactions get worse. Are they worse enough to the point that you should start considering cutting soy as well to see if that makes them then start getting better after a few days? Or are they just like a little bit worse and you feel comfortable writing it out a little bit longer? The stressful thing, obviously, being a mom, is that whatever decision you're deciding to either continue with the symptoms or like make your life harder, basically, like make your life harder or make your life harder. You're making a hard choice. So with that, depending on the symptoms is usually how I walk moms through that. So if symptoms are really severe, like my oldest had very severe symptoms, you can go with a removing as much as you can approach and then adding once you get to a point where you're not seeing any more symptoms. Or you can go the other route where if symptoms are smaller, they're not as bad, you're not in the hospital talking about blood transfusions, then you can look at it from, okay, I'm going to remove dairy. I'm going to give it a few days to see if there's any improvement, knowing that I'm still going to see symptoms for a few weeks, but some sort of improvement or baseline. It shouldn't get way worse a week after you cut dairy if you did cut dairy correctly. So relook at your diet, double check the other things that are going into your mouth, and then start to consider, all right, what's the next thing to look at? Or are symptoms so bad that I want to cut multiple things to try to get to a baseline of no reactions, and then start adding things back to your diet, because being that restrictive is difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would 100% agree, because I will say that over the years and talking with moms too, there is such a variety of, like, some people just have, some mucus and some specks of blood, but their baby's overall happy. Like in that case, I don't think you need to go crazy and cut out a million things all at once. But if a baby is like screaming in pain, waking up all night from reflux, has to sleep on your chest, speaking from experience here, a baby like that who is just, oh my gosh. Then, especially for your quality of life, like you want answers quick. Like you don't have time to afford to wait for weeks and weeks and weeks to just hope that this one allergen that you cut out is going to make a difference. So yeah, I think that's a really good answer. And for anybody who is looking for dairy and soy, one of the resources I have, I pinned it, is a dairy and soy free cheat sheet of hidden terms. So you can save this to the images on your phone or print it and laminate it, even put it like on a little ring. But that's super handy because, again, I agree with you. A lot of times and this is how it was for me too. It was like, oh, that has soy in it. You just, as you're going through this, you realize there's something you were consuming that you had no idea. Guys, did you know that there's lactose in birth control? Like it's everywhere. It was in a tea. There was soy in a tea bag that I almost consumed like a couple weeks ago. Like it's equally stressful, but equally rewarding, I guess, when you find it, because you're like, this was it. Like this was causing my problems.
Yes. Aha.
Okay, last question. And guys, thank you so much for hanging with us. I know this has been long and probably your brains are like overloaded with information. If you are, hopefully this is not making you more stressed, but making you maybe a little relieved, like that that the allergens are not in your breast milk for forever. If you're feeling pressured about formula, that you can just breathe and take a sigh of relief. Like it's not all about you. A part of this has to do with your baby and just working out some kinks. But the last question is one from Stacy. How do we know what age babies can have allergy testing? My pediatrician, when I went in for our 6-month appointment, suggested allergy testing for my daughter. And with my son, nothing, like it didn't really solve anything. So what would you say about that?
Yes, that's a great question. So this varies widely with medical professionals as well. All of the moms that I've talked to, some of them, when baby is really young, they'll get a referral, which is awesome, to an allergist, and we can start talking about testing. And a lot of other moms, like they won't even be able to get a referral until baby is 6 months to even a year old. So with that, my advice that I would give is typically when mom comes to me and says, hey, baby is 6 months or younger, it's very often that those results won't be accurate. So definitely if you feel like it'll help in some way, shape, or form, do it, right? So do it if you feel like the extra information could potentially help, but know that the results are not always accurate. And this is why. Most infant food intolerances are not what's called IgE mediated. So these tests, the skin prick test and the blood test, these are looking for IgE antibodies. They're looking for something very specific in the blood system. And so if your baby doesn't have that kind of reaction, which is what we think of as like a typical anaphylactic reaction, it can cause other problems, right? But this typical reaction that's going to last with baby through probably their entire life, like a peanut allergy, right? That's our typical that we think of when we think of an IgE reaction. It's a peanut allergy that this child is going to have for the rest of their life, most likely. That result for that skin prick test or the blood test is most likely going to be inaccurate because it's looking for something that's simply not there. So it's going to be like, hey, there's no dairy allergy. Yay! Like, congratulations, go eat all of the ice cream. But you know better, right? Like, you know that when I ate that block of cheese, because we all want to go eat a block of cheese, that you saw a reaction, right? And so it ends up causing a lot more confusion, and it all ends up also sometimes causing some friction with the medical professional, right? So with your pediatrician, that's like, yeah, I saw these results, and your baby's not allergic. So why are you coming in here saying that you've cut dairy and soy? And the simple answer is it's not an IgE mediated reaction, and most infant allergies are not.
Yeah, my own experience with my son, he had the blood work done several times and it always came back negative for dairy and soy. And then when he was about 10 months old, I kind of, through my research, knew better, like it's not necessarily going to show anything up, but we had paid our deductible for the year. So I was like, well, why not? Like, it's going to be free testing. So we went and had him tested and did the skin test. And the only thing that showed up positive was green beans. It was so random, which again, I was like, legumes, family of soy, like, okay, this is kind of related, but why didn't soy show up? And the allergist made a really good point too. He was like, hey, just because your baby tested positive for green beans, I actually don't want you to avoid it, because what happens is people do this testing and their baby does test positive and then they completely avoid it and it's not actually a problem. And so because I was avoiding legumes at the time, just in my own diet, I didn't give him green beans for a while, but when I did, like, he had no reaction. It was totally fine. So I think, yeah, it can create, I guess I feel like when it's skin related or when they start solids and they start having, an immediate reaction to something, like, definitely get some allergy testing to make sure that there's not a problem there. But in general, these gastrointestinal issues, I wish that there was an easy answer that way, but there just isn't.
Me too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I have been following Dr. Trill for a long time. If you are on Instagram, please follow her. I'm sure if you had I know there were so many questions and I wish we could get to them. But shoot her a DM, shoot me a DM. We would love to chat with you more. Again, this is such an isolating journey for so many people. I found my first friend locally who happens to have a baby with food intolerances, and that's after basically like 3 years of doing this. So it's not often that you come across somebody, and a lot of times people just don't understand and don't get it, and family and friends may or may not be supportive. So yeah, please, connect with us, like this Facebook page, like Free to Feed, if you want to stay up to date on what we're doing. And thank you again so much for your time. We're so glad to connect with you guys.
I love what you're doing. Thank you, everybody that was a part of this. Much love. And yes, definitely check out the website, subscribe, all the fun platforms. And I'm constantly putting up new content. I help any mom who needs any kind of consultations or any kind of help whatsoever. Totally free. I don't charge at all. I do ask moms sometimes to help me with my research by doing an interview, and that's all that I ask.
That's awesome. And some of the stuff we talked about is on her website too. So if you felt like we ran through things really quickly and you want to read more about it, hop on to the Free to Feed website, because there's lots of great articles on a lot of the things that we talked about. So yeah, and spread the word. If there's anybody else that could benefit from this information, please point them to our resources, because we just want to spread evidence-based information.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your Friday night.